Hello, my name is Lindsay, and today I'm going to be giving a video over a paper that I think every Idahoan should read and know about. Okay, and the paper is titled Observed and Projected Changes in Idaho's Climate. John T. Abatzoglou, I'm sorry dude if I butchered that. Adrienne Marshall and Grant Harley are the people who put this together. Thank you. I appreciate it so much that I want to put it in video format and put it on the internet. Okay, and so what I've got going on here is I have the paper pulled up in Google Scholar. If you didn't know, you can download a widget in Google Scholar, and when you pull up a paper, not all papers, it will give you a bulletized summary of the entire paper. And it's super cool because you can click on the bullets and it will take you to wherever it is in the paper that it talks about that. Revolutionary for kind of scanning papers and figuring out if you actually want to read them. Or for making an outline for a video. Okay, so I've got the outline pulled up and then I made a PowerPoint that kind of just puts some of the more prominent graphs and statistics in there. It just makes it easier to see it. Okay. So let's get into it. The beginning of the paper kind of gives you a very broad snapshot of the climate of Idaho as of 2021. And it talks about, how diverse the state is. It's one of my favorite things about the state is like we have this high desert here that's like a dry rangeland steppe ecosystem. And then in central Idaho, the wildwood, as I like to call it, we have temperate wet forests, and it talks about the climate. Okay, one thing that I find just so fascinating and interesting about this paper is that, in the introduction and the conclusion, it talks about sort of like the economic base of what is going to happen to Idaho and climate change, right? Because most climate change papers will talk about, okay, this is how it's going to change the ecosystems. But this one talks about like, okay, you're an Idahoan, most of the state is driven by agriculture or recreation economically. And it's like, how is that going to change us and our quality of life and how we experience life in the state of Idaho? It's a unique perspective. I recommend reading the introduction as well as the conclusion. Okay. All right, so after the introduction, it talks about observed changes in Idaho's climate. Okay, and just generally, it has gotten warmer. And this mirrors what has happened globally. We've generally seen an increase of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the state of Idaho. Globally, I think it's 2. Okay, and I think it's important to point out that that metric of like 1.8, I think it would be really easy to sit there and be like, okay, 1.8 is not that much. Okay, so it's important to note that that number is an average across years, across a time period. It's a very averagey average, and I think it can be a little bit misleading in some ways. So if there's anything you get out of this video is like, okay, it has warmed 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. At the end of this video, the very last picture I show, so skip there if you don't want to listen to the middle part, look at that picture, and that gives you kind of an idea of like what 1.8 means. Anyways, so this section also talks about, okay, it's warmed, that has an effect on snowpack, rain versus snow that we get as precipitation. It has an impact on stream flow, and it's put us in a drought. Okay, so here's the visual. And before I get into it, I just want to say that all of this data comes from NOAA. This graph comes from NOAA. NOAA is a perfect example of a federal institution that does things for you. It has a big database of data, right? And it has made it open source, and it provides a widget that you can manipulate the data and make graphics. So like you can get on there and you can select your state. You can pick any state. You can pick any time period. You can change the trend lines, okay? And it's all open source, available to you, provided by the federal government. All right? The link to this is right here if you want to pull some of that data yourself. All right? So here we are in the state of Idaho. The temperature has risen 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 200 years. So in reality, this graph should be a little bit longer. But I think it's important to note that 1.8 of warming has occurred predominantly since the 1990s. Okay, so if you put a trend line from 1900 to 1990, it has warmed, but not very much, right? And then if you were to put a trend line from 1990 to 2023, it has warmed a lot more. Okay, and this is getting at like the pace, the rate at which things are warming are increasing rapidly. And it's going to increase even more rapidly into the future, which we'll get into. Okay, so here's the visual of 1.8 for you. Okay, and then the paper has metrics about, it has a whole bunch of different observed data points, right? So like there's a 2-week lengthening in the freeze-free season, meaning that right now we have 2 weeks of weather that is not frozen, where historically those 2 weeks have been frozen. Okay. It's got data points like we have seen a 15% reduction in snowfall in the Bitterroot since 1950. Here's the graph for that. And I think that anybody who has lived in the state of Idaho their whole life, or at least 30 years, can tell you that we have less snow. I remember being a kid, like in the desert, being able to build a ramp so we could sled off of my grandma's house into her yard. That's how much snow there was. I remember having, enough of a snowpack to build snow caves. You cannot do that now. All right? And here's the data point for it, even though we all know it's actually happening, okay? And again, freezing level has increased by 500 feet since 1950. And these are just some of the more prominent data points. There's a lot in the paper, okay? It's hotter, there's less snow. One thing that I found very interesting in like this little dive is that we've actually been receiving more precipitation, okay? Here's the graph for that. If you look from 1900 to now, we're receiving slightly more rain or precipitation than we have been before. But again, what's important about that is it's coming as rain, as springtime rain, versus snowpack, okay? And the paper talks about how important snowpack is for the state, okay? Because we all know that Idaho has these droughty, hot summers where we don't get precipitation. And snowpack is incredibly important in delaying the release of mountain moisture to buffer or to compensate for this dry period. And it's really important because so much of the state is dependent on, pulling water from the rivers for agriculture. So much of our power comes from hydroelectricity. A huge part of our economy is people coming here to fish, right? And all of these things are affected by snowpack. All right. So here we are. We're getting slightly more precipitation than we have before, but we're in a drought. And the paper talks about the different ways that you can measure drought. I happen to think that looking at ground moisture is really important. It's not the end-all be-all, but I think it gives you a better idea than just straight precipitation, looking at how much water is actually in the soil. Okay, because I'm thinking about trees or vegetation, so the amount of water available in the soil is very important to me. So the Drought Palmer Severity Index, PDSI, which is the graph I have down here below, again, comes from NOAA. This tells you that we are in drought. Okay, the top part is not drought, green good. The bottom part is drought. Okay, and since 2010, despite receiving more precipitation, slightly more precipitation than before, We have been in drought since 2010. Okay. And if you look at this drought, it's not quite to the magnitude, but it's close to the time period we were in the Dust Bowl. People, the Dust Bowl is kind of where we're at right now. Like, we've all seen the sad pictures of people like packing up their farm and getting on carts because their farm literally blew away. And we learned about, the power of cover crop and sustainable agriculture. We learned about sustainable agricultural practices during this time. But okay, drought, Dust Bowl drought. We're pretty much there. Okay, if that gives you an idea. Okay, and this has consequences, right? Reduction in stream flow heavily impacts the salmon runs. So much of their, movement in their life cycle is based off of stream flow, stream temperature cues. It's big, right? We've been in drought since 2010. And drought, thirsty trees are stressed trees. And it makes them more susceptible to insect and disease, right? The drought weakens their immune system. And so when bugs or disease attack, they can't quite fight back. And we are seeing spatial shifts in vegetation. We're seeing conversion of forest land to shrubland and those types of things. So again, the trees are droughty and stressed. They're dying because of insect and disease. That in turn creates more fuels for forest fire. And currently we are seeing more forest fire than ever. We are seeing hotter forest fires than ever. These super hot forest fires are killing the seeds that are in the seed bank, right? Because there's seeds laying dormant on the floor of the forest waiting for the right conditions to pop up, and severe fire will kill all of that. Severe fire that gets into the canopy will completely kill the canopy, so there's no seeds to come from above to below, right? So we'll have these massive areas where reforestation isn't even a possibility naturally, right? Because we've killed the seed bank above and below. We've made the soil hydrophobic, meaning that like the water can't penetrate into the soil. There's nothing to, there's no woody debris or stuff like that to hold the moisture in the soil, okay? And that affects so much. I can attest to you that severe forest fire makes it very difficult to put the forest back. That's what I do, right? And so these are the consequences. And it's this like rapid cycle of, one change affects another thing, and then it's like a cycle, right? So this is where the paper gets into the projected changes. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. One thing that I want to note about the paper before we get into the projected changes is that this paper gives like a little FYI about why is the climate changing, okay? And if you're like me, an Idahoan, you might not have been exposed to that type of information in your regular public school education. Whether or not we talk about climate change in our public schools has gone back and forth over the years. I know that there was a time period that the state of Idaho was the only state that did not include climate change curriculum in public schools. I don't know where we're at now. I doubt that it's any better than when I was a kid. But if you have questions about, like, what is climate change? Why is it happening? This paper gives a really good, like, just so you know. It also gives a good, just so you know, about how we model climate, which I'm not going to talk about here because I think that I'm just kind of the opinion that, like, not all models are going to be accurate. Like, there was never a model that was actually accurate. But if you have all of these models, like, saying the same thing, it's probably going to happen, right? If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And you have some of the best and the brightest people putting together the RCP models. So, and this paper talks about that. So look at that. Box 1 tells you why the climate is changing, and then box 2 tells you about how they model that into the future. Okay, so projected changes. Here we go. This is the picture from the first slide, if you can recall, that shows the 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit increase. Okay, in this box right here, I've moved down here, and this is the window, right, of what we have observed. And this is what is projected. And you can tell that we've had an increase here, but it is going to get even more increasey in the future. As I kind of briefly touched on, the RCP 4.5 is like the medium intensity forecast, and the RCP 8.5 is the more extreme forecast. And again, some of the best and brightest scientists are working on these models, and I personally think that you can trust them. So from this point forward, it's projected that we will see a 6 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit increase. And again, you might be thinking like, 6 degrees Fahrenheit is not that much. But to give you an idea of like what exactly that means, I think these graphs are good at it. Okay, so this left panel would be the time period of 1970 to 2000. And then this right panel would be the time period of like the mid 21st century, so like 2069. You know, my children will be in their 50s. All right, so during this time period of like 1970, you would only see a heat index of 100 or above 100 less than 1 day per year. Okay, so I guess I should explain this. The heat index above 100 degrees, that is considered your black flag. Right? Once you hit above this index, it's black flag. When I was in the Marine Corps, one of the things that we would do is put out the black flag warning, right? And when the black flag warning goes up, it essentially tells people like, hey, it is so hot outside that you run the risk of injuring yourself or killing yourself by being physically active outside. So we would put up the black flag, and Marines were not allowed to PT outside. They would have to change their procedures about how they operated on the flight line. Basically, it's so hot, you're in danger of hurting yourself. Okay, and from 1970 to 2000, there was less than 1 day per year that it was hot enough outside that you would hurt yourself. Okay, and they're predicting in 2069 that there is going to be an upwards of 2 weeks, nearly 2 weeks, where it is so hot outside that you run the risk of hurting yourself. Look at the Snake River Valley. You know, it is possible that my children's children cannot go outside for 2 full weeks because it is so hot that they can injure themselves. That is what we're talking about when we talk about, you know, the 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming over this time period. People are like, okay, well, that's not that much. This is what we're talking about here, right? There will be 2 weeks that it is so hot that your children, your grandchildren can't even go outside to play because they could hurt themselves or kill themselves by doing so. That is what we're talking about here. This top one just talks about how there will be less of a freeze occurring. And I don't know if I mentioned this on the other slide, but the lack of freeze is really important from a forest health standpoint because the freeze, a hard freeze, will kill the bugs. We need a long period of frigid temperatures to knock back the bugs, and we're not getting that. And it's only going to be longer periods without it. So there we are. That is the culmination of what I have on my PowerPoint. But I just want to, again, highlight, go to the conclusion, and then read about, you know, what exactly this means for us as Idahoans. You know, the meat and potato people, how will it affect us? How is it going to affect our forests, our recreation? It talks about some of the challenges that we face in mitigating climate. Another good thing to read. So anyways, I hope that you get something out of this. If you made it to the end, thank you. I do this because I care. Whether you're a hippie or a cowboy, I want you to know that we are on the same team. I deeply love the state of Idaho. This is my heartland, this is my homeland, and I make this video because I care about how my children and my children's children will be able to interface and interact with this landscape. And you should care too. Thank you.